The government of Canada has announced 10 measures to protect the critically endangered southern resident orca population off the coast of British Columbia. Now, these measures are going to not only help protect the orcas, but they're going to affect other people in the area that use the oceans. We're going to talk about how that's going to affect them, how it's going to affect the orcas, and is it enough to help protect this wonderful orca population, this critically endangered orca population. We're going to talk about that on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I am your host, Andrew Lewin, and this is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean. And I'm happy we're talking about the ocean today. I have to admit, coming back from my trip, I've been feeling a little lazy. And this episode is a last minute recording. Usually I try and record them all on the weekend so that they can be scheduled out. But I'm doing this Tuesday night. This is released on a Wednesday. Sometimes you feel up and down about doing podcasting. Don't get me wrong. I love podcasting, but it seems like it's a lot right now. Regardless, we're going to push forward because I found a great article on CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, on their website. And it's all about orcas and the southern resident orca population that lives off the coast of British Columbia and the Northwest Pacific, or I guess Northeast Pacific, or just off the coast of Seattle, basically, out of Washington State. And so we're talking about that because this pod of whales is essentially, or this population of whales are essentially critically endangered. What that means is there are less than 100 of them. In fact, there are actually 73 of these orcas. And there's a bunch of protections that have been announced. But before I announce those protections and what that means for the orca population, what it means for other ocean users, is we're going to talk about how they got to where they've been. I've talked about this before on previous podcasts, but I always find it good to remind people, just in case you haven't listened to any of our 1,449 other episodes that we published. That's not a number that I made up. This is actually episode 1,450. But, you know, we are going to talk about this because it's really important to understand what happens when a population as iconic as an orca population decreases to a level where it becomes critically endangered, and what ramifications and consequences happen because of trying to protect this orca population, even though we don't know if this is actually going to be successful, really. Right? It's successful. It's worth protecting them. It's just whether these protections are going to be successful. That's the big question. But the way this population got into, there used to be about 150 of these orcas. And in the 1970s, the sort of the marine park boom of whale captivity happened. And in the 1970s, the southern resident orca population was the target of capture. And a lot of young orcas got snatched from their parents, from their mothers, and taken into a variety of marine theme parks throughout the U.S. Now, we know how that's sort of landed. You know, the experiment of connecting with orcas in captivity, by seeing what they can do in captivity, has pretty much failed for a lot of people. A lot of the marine parks in North America, or at least the U.S. and Canada, have stopped taking in new marine mammals for the most part, have to get rid of some of those marine mammals. And so it's pretty much dead in the water in, like, say, 50 years or 60 years. There's going to be the last orcas that are going to be in there. You're starting to see more and more push to get these captive orcas out of theme parks. So we talked about Lolita, who's in the Marine Aquarium right now. You know, they're looking at taking her out of that aquarium, where she's been alone for like 40 or 50 years, and she is hopefully going to be returned safely and successfully back into where she was once taken, in the Salish Sea, or in the Northeast Pacific. And so just off the coast of Washington and off the coast of British Columbia. these are important times to realize. There's a big push to get these animals out of captivity, which is great to get them out of captivity. Still a big risk, and we've never really done it too many times before, and so a lot of it's experimental. However, it's for the best for the animal. But regardless, we're not here to talk about captivity, but that's how it started. That's how, I believe the number is around 49 or 50 whales that were taken from their pods and into captivity. So if you think about it, they started off with 150, they lost about 49 to 50 of those animals, and then over time, those animals, the population never really recovered for one reason or another. One of the main reasons is because of the lack of Chinook salmon. We talked about this a number of episodes ago, where the type of Chinook salmon and the fat content in the Chinook salmon matters to orcas. But this southern resident orca population exclusively feeds on Chinook salmon. They don't really they're very picky in eaters. They don't like other fish or even salmon. They like their Chinook salmon. The fall or decrease in the Chinook salmon population has really affected the recovery of this population. The first is a long-lived species, orcas are. And so that means there's not, hundreds of animals born every year for this population. You get maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 if you're lucky. And these days, which we'll talk about in a second, the fact that the animals aren't even surviving that well, or there's not a lot of new births, or not a lot of new surviving births. And so when you have a decrease in salmon, which they exclusively eat on, compared to the transient population of orcas, which eat on everything, including marine mammals, the population is just not going to recover the way it should. When you add cumulative effects like marine pollution and plastic pollution that is being ingested by orcas through either other fish, the toxins from other fish that have been ingesting plastics and other harmful marine pollution, or they're ingesting it themselves, the orca population are taking on these metals, these petroleum substances and chemicals, and they're getting affected for their health. So having that cumulative effect, as well as ship strikes potentially, underwater noise from just more activity along the shores, along the coast, in shipping and whale watching and so forth, there are a lot of things that are going against this population, especially when you add to the fact, as I mentioned, they're a long-lived species. So it takes them a while to build back their population of over 40 species that were taken from them and never returned. Not only does that fill a huge void in the population from an emotional standpoint, but it also fills a huge void in the population from, hunting ability, foraging for food, finding new places to live, being together. That's a big hole to fill. And it's not getting filled. It's actually worse because the health of the new animals and the existing animals are just not what they used to be. So that's where they are in terms of health. That's why they're critically endangered. There's actually 73 animals, according to this article that I read at CBC, where there are 73 orcas left in this southern resident orca population. So it is a fight for survival, right? It is a fight to get them to not go extinct. We don't know how 73 animals are going to do in a new world of climate change, right? Of increased shipping, increased supply chain work. God knows we need it. The increase in supply chain. But it's just, there's so much going against them. And then they have to find food. So think about like a decrease in salmon population, the only food that they eat, the Chinook salmon. Now, how are they going to find food? You need energy to go find food. And if you don't have the food to get you the energy, you have to spend more energy to find the food. But you don't have that energy in the first place because you're not having the same amount of food. And when you start to starve because you don't have enough food and you're using a lot of energy, you lose weight. And your fat muscles, your fatty tissue, not fast muscles, but fatty tissue will break down. And all those chemicals that have been stored in the fatty tissue from the marine pollution, the plastic pollution, and so forth, starts to leach out and it starts to affect, the animal and can kill the animal if there's enough in them. So it's not looking good right off the bat for this orca population. So in comes government, right? The American government have created a couple of rules. One that was mentioned that stood out in this article, was the fact that they're not going to let any boat, non-commercial boat, go within 1,000 feet, which is about just over 900 meters from the whale. So you have that, right? Then you have on the Canadian side, there were 10 measures, and it doesn't really mention the 10 measures that were there to protect the critically endangered southern resident orca population off the BC coast. But what they include is mandatory speed zones in 2 areas near Swiftsure Bank, fishing closures, and interim sanctuary zones. And the commercial and recreational salmon fishing will be banned this summer and fall throughout the waters of the southern Gulf Islands. And from now until May 31st, 2024, vessels are required to stay at least 400 meters away from an orca in southern BC coastal waters. Now, these are some of the regulations. They're pretty big regulations. Before, I believe it was 200 meters that you couldn't get within 200 meters of a boat within 200 meters of an orca. Now that's a far ways away, not necessarily that far because it's not over a kilometer. But now, they want to increase it to 400, but some research are saying that the closures, the distance is not enough. We're at a point where this animal is critically endangered, and we need to make sure that they can have the ability to forage for their food, to hunt and search for their food. Now, how does the distance of a boat affect the hunting strategy of marine mammals, of an orca? How do you think? I'll give you a sec. It has to do with sound. When boats are close to orcas or any other marine mammal, the sound of the boat can interfere with the way the animals are trying to communicate underwater. Now, you've probably heard this before, whether on a documentary or maybe you've heard it out. You've had the opportunity and the wonder of hearing whales speak to each other and communicate to each other, underwater. It's quite fascinating. In fact, in the movie Finding Nemo, Dory, the blue hippotang, kind of made, like, she was talking to a whale and she was making the same noises that the whales were making, which is kind of interesting. It was kind of funny. But that's how they communicate. They communicate with clicks and sounds and all these different ways of having a language. And each orca population and each marine mammal population and pod even have their own language, their own slang, if you will. And so that communication helps them to hunt, helps them to protect each other, right, from boats and other things that can harm them, helps them hunt for fish, and helps them take care of each other. Just communication, social communication. Because a lot of times they're kilometers away from each other underwater. They can't see each other, but they can hear each other, and they can communicate with each other. And it's very important that they communicate. So having boats that are within a pod or between 2 animals, maybe a mother and its calf, or a mother and a juvenile whale, that can affect the pod interaction and the pod communication. So now you can't come within 400 meters in Canada or 1,000 feet, which is about just over 900 meters in the US. And if an orca comes close to you, because they're quite fast and they're quite mobile, you have to shut your engine off and you have to wait until they pass out of a certain zone, which is basically a radius of 400 meters in Canada and just over 900 meters in the States, in America. So these distances matter. These fishing closures matter. And the reason why they want to close fisheries is because these orcas need to eat. And if there are fishermen competing for the food of the orcas, then that can get that can interfere with their recovery, with the way that they eat. If they're already trying to taking extra energy to find food, and they finally find it, or they have a nice place where they go to feed on Chinook salmon, but it's being taken away by fishers. And I'm saying they're taking away everything, but there's a competition for it. Well, these orcas kind of matter. And you're probably saying, well, Andrew, what about the fishers? They have a job to do. They have money to earn. And I completely agree. And unfortunately, this is what happens when the government and us as citizens, whether you're in the US or in Canada, continue to allow all this stuff to happen to these orcas. We can't be blamed. I wasn't alive when marine mammals were being taken. I don't think so. I had nothing to do with marine mammals being taken, with orcas being taken from their families. And it pretty much horrifies me the way it happened. The stories that come out from Blackfish and other documentaries of, where people who were involved in the capture of orcas, it was super sad and affected them for the rest of their lives. They did it as a job and they didn't really know what they were doing. And that's obviously not good, right? And so that kind of handicapped the population from rebuilding and surviving. Over 50 animals were taken. That can't be good for a long-lived population. So protections are good and protections are necessary. But one researcher who's known as Lance Barrett-Leonard, who's he's a cetacean researcher and a senior research scientist with the Rain Coast Conservation Foundation, said that the measures need to go much further to help the animals thrive, including much broader fishing restrictions throughout their critical habitat. He also mentioned that the distance of that non-commercial boats should be from the orcas should be about 1,000 meters, should follow the U.S. and be as far as possible so you don't interfere with their communications. And that has to do so that they can eat and hunt better. Hunt and eat better, I guess we should say. Talking about fishing restrictions, again, fishing reduces Chinook salmon populations for the orcas. The orcas need more Chinook salmon, especially at certain times of the year, in the spring and summer, like I mentioned before. And the fact that their spring population in Chinook salmon is decreasing, and we're not exactly sure why, it's affecting, the amount of fish that are found for this orca population. So I would love to know what you think. That's the information. I would love to know what you think. Do you think that the measures that I mentioned in this article and on this podcast are enough to protect these orcas? Let me know by DMing me on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean. That's at How to Protect the Ocean. I would love to hear from you because I feel like this is a really interesting topic because it encompasses, this is what happens when we don't manage species well and the oceans well, and we end up ruining other people's lives. And it may not have had to come to that at this point. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. At How to Protect the Ocean is how you get a hold of me on Instagram. I would love to hear your thoughts. And that's the end of today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of How to Protect the Ocean. I am your host, Angelo, and have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.